What a beautiful day. Won't you be my neighbor? But respect my property. Property owners have rights, but causing harm to neighbors can have legal consequences. I'm Rusty Adams, and I'm the research attorney at the Texas Real Estate Research Center at Texas A&M University. My neighbors are asking questions. Here are some of them. My neighbor and I can't agree on the boundary. Very often, neighbors don't even necessarily know exactly where the boundary is. They may assume they know, but the boundary is defined by the property description, the description that's in the deed, regardless of anything that might be on the ground or any assumptions that the neighbors have. A fence doesn't necessarily define the boundary. A marker doesn't necessarily define the boundary. A fence or a marker of some sort may define the boundary if it's referred to in the deed or in the survey described in the deed. Sometimes the property descriptions will not exactly match up, and sometimes neighbors will disagree on what the property description says about the boundary. So there's a couple ways to approach that. One way is people can go to court and fight about it, but the problem is that's usually very expensive and time-consuming, stressful, so that's not always the best option. One way neighbors can deal with this is just to have an agreement. Neighbors can have an oral agreement where they just agree where the boundary is. One issue is that maybe one neighbor sells their property to someone else. Well, then that boundary agreement, that oral boundary agreement, is very often not binding on the new owner because they don't know about the boundary agreement. Often the best way to handle that is by having a written boundary line agreement. Write it down, agree where the boundary is, describe that boundary, and then have some sort of marker on the ground. It can be a fence, it can be large stones or something like that, but some sort of physical marker that can be referred to and that's referred to in the agreement. And then write it down and sign it, and then you have a boundary line agreement. It's my property and I can do what I want. In general, property owners can do with their property what they want to. Now, there are some restrictions on that. A property owner can't damage their neighbor's property by nuisance, negligence, or physical harm to the neighbor's property. Some of the things that can be nuisances may be things like noise, bad smells, runoff, waste products, those kind of things. Now, of course, that can be further restricted by zoning ordinances or deed restrictions, and they run with the property generally. Whenever a property has deed restrictions, those deed restrictions are of record, and they're placed in the property records in the county clerk's office. When you buy property, you buy with notice that those covenants exist. The thing about zoning ordinances and deed restrictions is that those are exceptions. If it's not deed restricted property or if it's not subject to zoning ordinances, your only restrictions are nuisance, negligence, harm to the property. My neighbor built over the property line. Sometimes people will build over a boundary line. Very often it's an accident when they do that. They put something on the ground that they don't realize it's over the boundary line, or they'll put it there based on a misunderstanding of where the boundary line is. And so this is an encroachment. The neighbor can force that to be removed and can go to court and get an order that the encroachment must be removed from his property. My neighbor's property drains onto mine. Normally, property can drain however it naturally drains. If you have rainwater that is flowing down from your property onto adjoining property, that is your right to do. You don't have any obligation to stop that if you have the higher property. However, if you make modifications to your property, let's say you dig a ditch or you put impervious ground cover that allows more runoff than would be normal, and it runs off onto your neighbor's property and causes damage to the property, then you may have liability for that. My neighbor is contaminating my property. A landowner may be liable to his neighbor if he causes or allows a damaging substance to encroach upon his neighbor's property or groundwater. These might include agricultural waste, salt water, air contaminants, or dangerous or toxic chemicals. My neighbor's excavation is destroying my land. Land is entitled to what's called lateral support from the land next to it. Basically what that means is one piece of land holds up the land next to it. And so sometimes people will make an excavation on a property as part of construction or as part of development or changing the drainage pattern or for whatever reason. And when they do that, they remove dirt very close to the property line. And when that happens, it can cause the neighboring property to cave in, wash away, etc. If that happens, there's potential liability there. Where does the fence go and who has to pay for it? In certain circumstances, a fence may be a nuisance. For example, it may restrict access or pose a danger. As long as the fence is not a nuisance, however, it can be any type of fence the landowner chooses. Again, other regulations, ordinances, or deed restrictions may apply. When a fence is built on a boundary line, it's very common that neighbors share the cost of that fence. However, they are not required to do so. If it's built on the line and they share the cost of the fence is jointly owned. If it's built on the line and one neighbor pays for the fence, then that neighbor owns the fence. If it is on the boundary line, a neighbor may attach their own fence to that fence. They may not change the fence. If the fence is on one side of the boundary line, the neighbor cannot attach his fence to that fence without permission, as that would be trespassing. A jointly owned fence may not be removed except by consent or after 6 months written notice. If a fence is on one side of the property line, the owner may require a neighbor's adjoining fence to be disconnected by giving 6 months written notice. Likewise, if a neighbor's fence is attached to a fence owned by another, 6 months written notice is required before detaching the fence. Neighbors may enter into agreements about the placement and maintenance of fences. Such agreements should be in writing and recorded in the property records of the county where the properties are located. My neighbor's trees hang over my property. This is a very common issue. You have a tree that hangs over the property line, and people wonder, one, whose tree is it? And two, what can I do if it's hanging over onto my property? The tree belongs to the person who owns the land where the trunk is. The owner of the tree may be liable if the encroaching tree limbs or roots damage the neighbor's property. If that tree hangs over the boundary line, it's an encroachment. If the neighbor wants to trim it back, the neighbor can trim it back. The restrictions on that are that the neighbor can't go onto the adjoining land to do so without permission. Also, they can only trim it back to the property line unless they have permission. Neighbors should also make sure that they don't damage the tree when they're doing so.